Two easy words: jobs and growth. We carry a narrative on all our heads that how can you do trade agreements in bad times? Well, in fact, history has told us, at least in the United States, that we're much more likely to do trade agreements in bad times than in good times because people are desperate. They want jobs, they want growth, they think that possibly these trade agreements can deliver that, and they're willing to take a chance and take a risk. We find this in polling data. Again, we carry a narrative in our head that working class people are against trade, it's more upper class people who are in favor of trade. In fact, we know from multiple surveys in the United States, including GMF surveys, that Democrats are more likely to support trade now than are Republicans. And I think it's really about jobs and growth. That's a very good question. We don't know how many jobs these will create. I think we have to remind ourselves there have been gross exaggerations on both sides of this argument. The North American Free Trade Agreement was to create all sorts of jobs that it did not. There are claims of how many jobs these have destroyed, and those are probably exaggerated as well. Certainly, it will increase exports for the United States, which, given our situation, is useful. How many jobs will be attached to those exports is somewhat questionable because the reality is we can produce a lot more with fewer workers now because our productivity is so strong. So I think there'll be a marginal increase in the number of workers that are new jobs that are created by these trade agreements. But the critics who worry about increased imports destroying some jobs in the United States are also correct. I mean, trade is about change. Trade is about disrupting the old economy. And I think that we will see not only more exports to Korea, for example, where we have the greatest opportunity for job creation, but we're going to see increased imports from Korea as well. And that will, over time, probably also impact on labor in the United States. I think that we should not make the connection between the fact that these have passed finally in the Congress, that there's somehow new support in the United States for multilateral trade agreements, the Doha Round. I think the sentiment in Washington today is extreme frustration with the Doha Round. I think there are very few people who entertain any hopes that this will actually get resolved anytime soon. Generally, when Doha comes up in polite conversations, people say it's dead, and they are frustrated that the world has not been willing to acknowledge it's dead and move on. So while there is still some hope, I know, in Europe or in parts of Asia, that if the United States would only move and change and adapt, we could somehow finish the Doha Round. I think the perspective in Washington is there's not nearly enough on the table to make this worth finishing. The United States needs to increase its exports. It needs to get its trade balance under control. And trade agreements, as what the Doha Round looks like now, which would actually increase the U.S. trade deficit, are not going to fly in the United States. So there's growing interest here, after many, many years of talking about it, in doing something with Europe. The GMF is in partner with other groups looking at what can be done transatlantically in a bilateral sense, also in a multilateral sense, to further trade. And so doing something bilaterally between the U.S. and Europe is definitely in the discussion. People in the White House are seriously looking at this, again, because they think it may deliver jobs and growth. That's what they're worried about. They're not worried about more trade deals. They need jobs and growth. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has come out and called for an eventual free trade agreement between the U.S. and Europe. The issue has even been introduced into the presidential campaigns. The leading Republican candidate for president, Governor Romney, has suggested that he might be interested in pursuing some kind of free trade agreement with Europe if he becomes president. So I do think that that idea, which has been around for years, is now beginning to get some traction, and it would be an attempt to flesh out the U.S. trade policy going forward.